Ladies and gentlemen, our program will now begin. Please welcome the CEO of the Churchill Club, Karen Tucker.
Thank you so much, and welcome to the Churchill Club. Thank you for joining us tonight. We are most privileged to have with us Reid Hoffman and Joichi. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Our thanks also to Citrix for hosting this gathering and for our long-term partnership, which has definitely strengthened our ability to carry out our work. For our new guests in the audience, a brief introduction to Churchill Club, a nonprofit devoted to innovation, economic growth, and societal benefit. It began in Silicon Valley in 1985 as a place where important people say important things at the nexus of policy, business, and academia. And of course, over the years, it has evolved, just as technology itself has evolved to impact so many different aspects of our lives. So for 29 years, this organization has played a key role in convening people, exposing them to new ideas, and connecting them with one another. We thank our members and supporters here in the room. We could not do this without you, and we encourage others to please lend your support and help ignite more extraordinary conversations, such as the one that we're going to be part of this evening. Next up, on May 29, it's the 16th annual Top 10 Tech Trends program with 5 leading venture capitalists who will share with us trends that are not obvious today, but they believe we will see explosive growth in about 5 years' time. Next, on June 3rd, we will present Dun & Bradstreet CEO Bob Kerrigan in conversation with Jeffrey Moore, and they are going to be talking about leadership and business transformation. If you're tweeting tonight, please do use the hashtag Churchill Club, and you'll find Twitter codes, other Twitter codes in your printed programs. Our speakers, Reid Hoffman and Joichi, share many common interests and bonds, as we'll soon hear. As entrepreneur, executive, and angel investor, Reid Hoffman has played an integral role in building many of today's leading consumer technology businesses. In 2003, he co-founded LinkedIn in his living room in Mountain View. Today, LinkedIn has more than 300 million users. Reid was also a founding board member and executive at PayPal and an early investor in Facebook, Zynga, and more than 80 other startups. Today, he is a partner at LinkedIn, or Greylock Partners rather, an executive, a chairman at LinkedIn, and he's on the many, many boards. Yeah. Zynga, Mozilla, Shopkick, Edmodo, Kiva.org, and also a board observer at Airbnb. And he was honored in 2010 with an SV Forum Visionary Award and named a Henry Crown Fellow by the Aspen Institute. Joichi is a leading thinker and writer on innovation, global technology policy, and the role of the internet in transforming society. He is director of the MIT Media Lab, a cross-disciplinary research lab that is now in its 3rd decade and has to be one of the coolest places on earth. And if you don't know that now, you will, I'm sure, after the conversation this evening. He is board chair of Creative Commons, and he sits on the boards of Mozilla Foundation, Sony, the New York Times Company, MacArthur Foundation, Knight Foundation, and Digital Garage, an internet company that he co-founded in Japan, among others. He was an early investor in more than 40 companies, including Flickr, Kickstarter, and Twitter. And among Joy's many honors, Business Week named him one of the 25 most influential people on the web in 2008, and he received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Oxford Internet Institute in 2011. Please give your warmest Churchill Club welcome to Reid Hoffman and Joichi.
So I thought I would kick this off with the story about how Joey and I met, because it actually was a similar pattern of thinking that ended up in the founding of LinkedIn, which is Peter Thiel, who was the CEO of PayPal, came to me and said, you know, we're just not figuring out Japan. It's getting slower and slower. I keep getting longer and longer dates for when we're going to launch. You know, can you go figure this out and get Japan launched? And I was like, okay, well, let me go find out what's going on. And I went and discovered that we were doing the classic thing that a company does when they get unknown, which is we had hired some lawyers to give us the risk factors. And each week, the lawyers would give us a longer list of risk factors, right? And give us more reasons why trying to launch PayPal in Japan was a disastrous idea and why we should possibly, not do this. And I knew that Peter would literally go ballistic if I walked back with that answer. And I was like, okay, how do I solve this problem? Well, obviously the problem is we need an entrepreneurial person, not lawyers. So let me figure out the best person I know. And I literally called every smart person I knew who knew about Japan and said, give me the list of the 3 best people you know who are entrepreneurs, who understand Japan, who I could use to figure out this path. And I found on 3 of them was all headed by this guy, Joey Ito, right? And I was like, all right. So I called those 3 back and I said, okay, which of you have the best relationship with Joey? Found out which one. Said, oh, I know Joey really well. Great. Intro me to Joey, please. And so we had an email introduction, got on the phone, and I said, look,
This is because you didn't have LinkedIn then, right?
Yes, precisely. Well, this is the kind of pattern that led to thinking about LinkedIn and why what might be an interesting product and useful to people. And so basically, I got on the phone and I said, look, I know that because Joey at the time had started a venture firm called Nyatni, which is an awesome, I actually, for the intellectually wonkish, this wonderful name, which it has to do with theory of humans and human intelligence and plasticity and whatnot, and you can look it up later. It's not really relevant for tonight. And so I was like, I don't really have anything to really offer you because we don't really do anything with venture. But if you had portfolio companies or something else, we, PayPal, can you help us with this problem? And Joey's like, no problem. I like helping entrepreneurial efforts. I think I got the right guy. Let me go check in with him and I'll get back to you. And he literally got back to us with a guy that this guy arranged for us to get a letter from the Japanese Financial Services Authority that said, you can launch yen, but as long as you don't launch Japanese, we won't judge you to be doing business in Japan, so you can start getting data and start having accounts and everything else so that you can start getting the traction, start setting your product, and you can work out the kind of issues around banking later. It's literally the only country in the whole world where we got this kind of clarity of not because one of the problems, by the way, in the rest of the world, more so than the US, is that going afoul of banking regulation is what I called orange jumpsuit time, which is criminal, not just civil. So you could land at the airport and be put in handcuffs and taken away. So getting this right was really important. That was really helpful. And then, and so I was like, hey, call him back. That was really helpful. Anything I could do? He said, well, I'm coming out to San Francisco. You want to have coffee? I'm like, yeah, that's easy. And that's how it started told from my perspective. So with that, with Joey, I give him a much simpler intro than the one that you just heard. Of course, the one you just heard is accurate. My intro of Joey is college dropout, director of the MIT Media Lab. Right. So, why did you take the Media Lab job? How did you come to it? And how does a college dropout end up being the director of the MIT Media Lab?
So first of all, I never thought I would be in academia. My sister's an academic. I was surrounded by academics, and I dropped out 3 times, not just once. So I tried. So I knew very well that I didn't want to be an academic.
And now you tell people to finish the degree.
No, I still think you should finish a degree. I have failed at that. But they called me. I mean, they asked very casually whether I would be interested, and I said, well, of course I'm interested in anything, But when they officially called me in, I had no idea, whether I would be interested. But it was amusing enough that university like MIT would even consider having a college graduate be the director of their lab. And so I went in, and then it was like 2 days of interviews, 30-minute interviews with students and faculty and staff, and the quality of the conversation and sort of the energy was just addictive. And I realized that it was a whole. It's hard to explain. We can go into this in more detail, but that was really what converted me. And so very quickly they decided that I was the right person, and I decided that they were right. And then there was a little a little bit of raised eyebrows as the process made its way through the institute. They said, when I went to meet the dean, the first thing she said was, "So I hear you don't have a degree." But in the end, the provost, who was a person who had to kind of okay it, he said, "I don't see any problem," and he's now the president of the university. But MIT's turned out to be super flexible. I think I'm the first non-degree holder in the sciences. I think there's probably somebody else in the humanities, but.
Well, I told you this, but one of the funniest parts of that experience for me was I was one of your reference calls.
Oh, right.
And they called me and they said, "Well, what do you think?" And I said, "Well, I'm trying to hire him. But what else do you want to know?" So,
right.
But why do you think, I mean, we're going to touch on this at multiple points throughout this, but what's your beginning statement about why the Media Lab matters? Like, why is it kind of the next 10, 20, 30 years in terms of what we're trying to create in the world? That's kind of the more fundamental intellectual reason you took it, and I think we should start with that.
Yep. So, and I think you're similar, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the reason I got into entrepreneurship, a lot of it was to try to create impact and to disrupt. So, because I was in television and media and surrounded by big companies that were moving slowly and destroying value, in my view. And so, to me, creating disruption.
Actually, your specific line was, "I'm an anti-monopolist."
I'm an anti-monopolist, yes.
Yes.
And to me, as a 20-something-year-old, having come out of these large institutions where 20-something-year-olds didn't have any leverage, internet companies was a really great way to disrupt television and all these other things. And so, as I was doing venture, though, I also saw some limitations to the kinds of things you could do. So, there was a certain category, a profile of a good fundable startup, and you start getting to where there's some room on the edges, but fundamentally, they have to have a certain scale, they have to have a certain kind of cash efficiency, and there's a certain thing about it. But then when I got to the Media Lab and I looked at what they were doing, there's a whole bunch of other stuff that was disruptive and important that wouldn't be venture funded, that could be venture funded eventually, but especially in the exploratory phase. And there are a lot of different dynamics. And maybe because the person who invests in it isn't necessarily the one who's going to benefit. So because the ideas go out into the commons. It could be because it's super high risk. It could be because it takes a long time. Or it could be because it's just, so there's a bunch of different reasons. And so I realized that just doing Silicon Valley venture wasn't going to solve all of the problems. And there's a whole other problem space of impact that needed to be addressed. And that I knew a lot of smart people were here working on the Silicon Valley problem, but I didn't see, the Media Lab was weirdly unique enough for me to realize that was worth trying to get right.
Mm-hmm. So let's, because this is something, one of the key things is innovation is part of the future. If you don't, with the increasing Moore's Law, or just Moore's Law, and then the increasing top rate of companies, the question is, classically, you have to reinvent. So the question of where innovation and where invention comes, and there's universities, and then there's corporate labs, and then there's startups. And as you mentioned, part of the whole thing in terms of startups is, look, startups have this one mission, focused amount of capital. Usually it's take an invention and go to market with it, like figure out how the product market fit works, build a team around that, try to build something as a commons for the platform, or to do R&D and just figure out something that any other people could use. That's actually not where that model goes. Now, how much, there's obviously classically all the things with Xerox and everything else from the, the history books, but I think there's still some interesting place where corporate models have at least generated value and maybe there's something to do. But one of the really key things is to figure out how universities can do that. And of course, classically universities kind of go, well, we're kind of separate and it's pure thinking and we're separate from those considerations. And that's actually one of the things that I think has led to a certain amount of failure about the invention of things. And I think one of the reasons why, to prompt you, the Media Lab was like, no, we're actually building stuff. We're actually not trying to just do, kind of like scholastic research, but actually things that actually, bear on target.
Right. That was actually one of the only weird meetings I had when I joined MIT. The dean of science was a family friend, and he called me into his office. He said, I question the scholarship in the Media Lab. You know, it's like, oh, okay, well, so do I. You know?
Best thing I've heard all day.
But I think that's the thing is like most university departments are very focused on scholarship, and then at MIT, which is more applied than most places, it's an institute, you have labs that are funded through grants, and then you have the academic departments which are about the scholarship, and there's like this healthy church and state kind of tension. But the Media Lab, they completely hacked the system by creating a lab that also has its own academic program, and we're primarily funded by companies. So we have 80 companies that pay a consortium membership, and so we have like 3 visits a day from companies, and our students spend all day building and then explaining what they're doing to companies. So all day long they're getting input, and the companies are hugely varied across the spectrum. So we have everything from Lockheed Martin to Hasbro to Fox News to the Knight Foundation. So
And Google.
And Google, that's right.
Just
Google,
be local.
yeah, just be local. And Samsung and LG and Nokia, and so what's interesting is we get tons of commercial constraints and real world input, and then the other part is because we have this academic program that's wrapped in a lab. We have different faculty have different levels of this, but we can, if we want to, have less focus on the scholarship, where the scholarship comes as a byproduct of impact, rather than the experiment being the doing being a byproduct of I call it practice over theory. I'm much more interested in things that work in practice but not in theory, rather than the other way around, which is where a lot of people from other universities end up, which is they have a lot of theory that don't work in practice. I'd rather have it the other way around.
One of my favorite expressions, as you know, is in theory there is no difference in theory and practice.
So you're the philosopher.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, exactly. So let's actually briefly detour to how do companies interface with the Media Lab? Like what does that look like?
So different companies interface in different ways. So the core model is we get $250,000 from 80 companies that makes up that's kind of the entrance ticket, and for that you get a non-exclusive right to all of our intellectual property, which is maybe useful. I mean, we had e-ink and we had some things, but that's not our primary focus, is to generate IP. But it's so that when you're in a meeting, anything that's generated, you can go back home and use. And then we have 2 annual meetings where it's like the grand ball, where all 450 demos are running and you get to see all the research updates and things like that. But then throughout the year, the companies interact with us. And some companies will fund students and fund projects, but the interactions are kind of interesting. And this is, it's sort of hard to say on the record, but it's true, which is that because the core funding, we don't have actual deliverables, they're not grants. So most of my students and faculty don't have deliverables. They're trying to create answers to questions that the companies don't know to ask yet. So what we're trying to do is discover things that they haven't really thought of yet. And the math works out to, for the cost of a fully loaded engineer, you're getting about 400 or 500 scientists working on 450 random projects that may or may not have value to you right away. But some companies use it as a hedge against being completely wrong, like the Japanese were all focused on analog high definition for a long time. And the Media Lab was the one that kept saying, no, it's going to be digital, analog's not working. And they showed them, and the Japanese company said, oh, maybe we should pivot. So there's some of it is that there's like e-ink for the Kindle created, the whole e-book thing. So they're sometimes looking at new trends. A lot of the wearable stuff came from the lab. And some of the companies get inspired and do their own thing. Some companies like Samsung hires, so the people who worked on the Samsung watch, that team's ours. Google Glass, Google hires a lot of our people, so a lot of the know-how goes out that way. And then some of the companies just network with each other, so it's kind of like a club. So different companies have different things, and some companies just come in when they have an innovation surge, when they're trying to be very innovative. They bring all their senior management in, and for a couple years they interact with us. Whereas some companies like Toshiba have been members for like 29 years.
But usually it's an interactive model rather than a kind of like an outsourced lab.
Oh yeah. So we definitely don't do what you tell us to do.
Yeah.
And what
I think that's almost by definition for how it works.
And what's interesting is there's a certain category of company who just pays. They come to the shows. but then it's kind of like a brand thing where a couple of the senior people come and they see, and they get some value out of it, but they're actually the ones that fund the other category of companies who come and engage aggressively. And it's what's interesting is it's a competition of ideas. So if you come in with really interesting data, students will swarm around it, or if you come in with a really interesting idea, you'll get a whole bunch of people working on it. So the really cool ideas and the really cool companies end up getting sort of an unfair share of attention. The cool thing about cool at the Media Lab is it's not what you would normally think. So, an accounting company could get a swarm of students, like we can talk about this later, but like the MIT Bitcoin Club, right? So what you have with that are hundreds of nerds interested in bookkeeping. That's basically what you have. And so suddenly they want to know, they want to meet accountants, And so for me, what's interesting about looking at which companies are doing well with which ideas is to see the sort of variety of the stuff that kids geek out on. And it's also like one of my students who's just the biggest nerd in the world. He was hacking on a Volkswagen, on an Audi, and they got so excited by his 2-day hackathon thing. They gave him a free Audi, and he's driving around and he's fully insured. And I'm like, you don't want to give him a car, Yes. But I think it's interesting. That's what's fun is when the companies bring a toy in, and then they see the Media Lab students swarm over it. And I think the key point about the lab is that because it's undirected, no one asks permission. There isn't a single PowerPoint. There isn't a single presentation. Everybody just does stuff. And so what happens is, as soon as there's interaction, sometimes they'll come in the next day and the thing will be done. And then it's like, well, what do we get to do next? And so that's kind of what you're shooting for.
So let's shift a little bit to kind of views of the future. So, when Joe and I were chatting about what are the things that would be interesting with folks here, one of the things we realized is from a Silicon Valley perspective, looking over at the Media Lab, what are the things that you're saying that would be interesting for us to pay attention to?
Well, so I think if you look at, what was it, Annalise Saxenian's book about regional advantage, about why Silicon Valley grew when the loop failed, I think a lot of it had
the loop is a road outside of Boston.
Yeah, I'm starting to talk like a Bostonian.
Yes, exactly.
Is in the old days, to create anything like a videotex system, right, that would have been the version of the web before we had the web, would have cost hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars to do like a Minitel. It's probably hundreds of millions. So in order to roll out something like that, where you're building everything from the bottom up, it would have cost so much money that you would have had to really plan it. And so you'd have an MBA write a plan, and then a company or a fund would fund it, and then you would hire the designers and engineers, and you'd build the thing and whatever. As the cost of, so the internet made distribution, collaboration costs nearly zero, and Moore's law made computation nearly zero. So suddenly what happens is the cost of trying something. So if you had done a Google, Facebook, or Yahoo before the internet, it would have been a $100 million upfront venture. In these cases now, you build the thing, then you raise the money, and then you come up with a plan, and then you go public. So it used to be MBA, money, engineer, and now it's engineer, money, and then MBA if you need to go public, right? Sometimes. So, and then I love first round capital's MBA as a service. MBAS. But I think what's important, so that we know happened, and that what happened was it pushed innovation out of the large institutions with the authority and the money into dorm rooms and startups, and was venture funded, right? So that happened for software and internet services. I think that's happening in hardware, where you're seeing that the prototyping costs now, the manufacturing costs, companies like PCH International that basically do supply chain are now open for business for venture. AQS, all these guys are starting to open up manufacturing in Shenzhen to venture. And then you've got interesting things like Kickstarter that completely changed the cash flow model that also screwed up startups. So for instance, I Formlabs, I'm an investor in that. It's one of some of our graduates, but I think they got 3 million in orders from Kickstarter before they started. So normally that would be the big weird chunk of funding that made hardware companies look different from software companies. Well, if you get the money first, then that goes away. So there's a bunch of parameters that have changed that I think make hardware ventures important. And then what I would say is also because you have to build them into an ecosystem of software and network services, they have to be a little bit more software driven rather than hardware centric. So the traditional companies that had hardware expertise, like the HPs of the world that had 5-year roadmaps in hardware, are having a harder time than the people who think like software. So the big software giants, obviously Facebook, Google, Microsoft, are obviously getting into hardware, but the more interesting component of it for me are the little startups. So that, I think MIT and the East Coast tended to be good at that, but also I remember a lot of funds in Silicon Valley always used to say we don't do hardware. And so I think there's
Other
a little...
than semiconductors, but yes.
Yeah. Well, they used to do hardware, and then they started focusing more and more. Well, and software is a low-hanging fruit from a sort of profile perspective. So my question, which is interesting, is I think we have an advantage right now, regional advantage in Boston on hardware, just because we have a lot of that. But I see Silicon Valley picking up and catching up. But there's a similar dynamic now with with biotech, and I can go into the details if you want. But the cost of designing and deploying and innovating on bio stuff like memories and sensors and all kinds of stuff is going down, and that's another area that in the Boston sort of Cambridge area we have a lot of expertise. It'll be interesting to see. It's not going to be exactly the same, but generally the diminishing of costs pushes innovation to the edges, which changes the architecture of innovation, and Silicon Valley is really good at it. I think Boston has some domain expertise in some of these new areas, so what will be interesting is whether we collaborate. Does the Silicon Valley catch up to Boston? So I'm really interested in where that goes.
Well, you might want to describe a little bit of Ed Boynton's work and how computation is being directly integrated. I mean, the cybernetics is taking entirely whole new levels.
Yeah. So this is partially I use the word antidisciplinary instead of interdisciplinary, because interdisciplinary is when you get a chemist and a biologist and a mechanical engineer working together. Okay. Well, that's great, but it really doesn't work that well because they all they set their. What's really funny that because this science lab thing is funny is when you walk into, they all are looking at the same thing, but chemists, biologists, and physicists all set their microscopes differently, and they use slightly different words, and it's interesting because they'll look at the same phenomenon, but they can't really talk about it in the same way. But when you're actually trying to do something, right? And this is, I think, what's important is all of our faculty have a mission. So Hugh is trying to make robotic limbs. Ed's trying to understand the brain. And what you find is, so for instance, in our lab we have a guy who does computational optics, and they do light field stuff, so like the Lytra camera, right? So all those guys that work on computational optics think about cameras all the time. Well, it turns out that there's a problem, or an interesting thing, which is there's a nematode that is the first organism to have its connectome, the neurons mapped, because it has a small number of neurons. But what you really want to understand when you're looking at a brain is not how it's connected, is what's going on in it. So like a connectome is kind of like a Google map of a snapshot, right? But what you really want to know is who's driving and what are they thinking, and are they drinking, and where are they going? You want to interrogate the drivers. So you actually need to look inside the cells to see what's going on electrically, mechanically, and chemically. So we need to do real-time imaging. And so what happened is we had in the next lab, in the media lab, when the guy does the light field, he says, well, why don't we see if we can make a light field microscope to look at the neurons to then image the brain in real time. And so we invented the first light field microscope, and we applied computational optics to neurology. And the thing is, usually the best computational optics guys in the world don't hang around with the best brain guys in the world. And now we're working on trying to build circuits and putting them into the brain. And what gets really funky and interesting here is there's a computational element to trying to understand what's going on in the brain. There's also stuff that you might do electrically, and there are researchers doing the pieces of it. But what's funny is you're starting to see a hybridization where the really interesting solutions require understanding electronics, computation, and biology and genetics. But what's really interesting is it's starting to become fungible, right? So it's like you can, there's like, so George Churchill, whose main position is at Harvard, but has a position with us at the Media Lab. You may have seen his demo. He wrote a book called Regenesis. He encoded the whole book into the gene sequence of a bacteria by just recording base pairs as memory. So you could actually sequence the bacteria, and which he made 7 billion of, just so that everyone could have a copy, and you could read the book. Well, it turns out chromosomes are higher density than hard disks and lower power. So an archiving company came to him and said, "Well, can you do video?" Maybe. He said, "Okay." So now he's designing a microbe that takes light, converts it into a protein that then takes a base pair and stores it. And what they're going to do is they're going to create a biological video archival system that all you have to do is sequence the gene and you can get the video out. And it's extremely low power and of extremely high density. So his view is that a lot of computation is going to go into biology. But then we have other people in the lab saying, no, we're going to use biology to make computer chips. And then so what gets really interesting is if you're trying to tackle a particular problem, like let's fix the eye. Well, there's a genetic approach, which is what Ed in our lab is working on, which is to use this expression to create a sensitive nodule that gets attached to certain neurons, transferred there by a virus. So you would inject it, and it would make your blindness okay. We've shown that this works in mice. Or you could build a robotic eye, or you could, but what's important about this is that it doesn't work when you have these disciplines. You really have to break the disciplines apart, and the key though is not to allow it to be called interdisciplinary. And so this is not to bash the D school, but this is just to contrast it. Because I love the D school folks, and we talk to them a lot. But the D school is having people in their disciplines come together in an interdisciplinary class to learn and then go back to their disciplines. So what we do is we make people leave their disciplines. They may publish papers and things, but they become anti-disciplinary, and they're not allowed to say, I don't do that, I'm not a, everybody codes, everybody has to hold the pipettes. You have areas of core expertise, but you're supposed to be fluid, and we have a degree program in anti-disciplinaryism, which is anyway, so I went off on a tangent. But
no, but that's actually part of the innovation. I mean, how do you put part of the thing is, I think you're right, the future is engineering and design put together in a multidisciplinary, anti-multi, same thing, right? Where it's integrated, because the key, and for example, when you were talking about MBAs, one of the things that I actually remember that is, whenever I give talks to MBAs, one of the things I say as investors is two negative factors that need to be explained away for me to make an investment. One's an MBA and the other one's a background in management consulting. And that's because it's this creation element. It's what is the product that's kind of key to that. And you actually need to have a multidisciplinary approach in order to get that, because it's not elaborating a scholarship field. It's actually, how do you solve this problem, and what are the different kinds of resources that cause the right conceptual map and the right kind of technology that can address it.
Right.
And that's part of that's the reason why, I remember having my mind blown by going into endpoint until I haven't going, oh my God, you're tying computational stuff directly to the mouse's brain?
But it turns out brains throw off a lot of information, and so one of the really key things is, well, it very quickly becomes a big data problem, and then it suddenly helps to have the storage unit of Toshiba as a sponsor, because
exactly. So let's go back to hardware briefly. One of the threads that's also interesting, so obviously part of what's happening is software is beginning to infect everywhere. It's infecting biology. It's a question of direct hookups. It's a question of whether or not anything from, do you build the computers biologically, or do you build biological systems that are solving computational problems, and how does that infect? How do you affect encoding and decoding the genome is obviously part of this. All that. It's also hitting hardware in interesting ways, and we touched on it only very briefly with, PCH and all that. And I think a little bit of what would be helpful for Silicon Valley folks is for you to reflect a little bit of what you've seen from Shenzhen and other kinds of areas.
Yeah, I think the Shenzhen story is key for us, because one of the first places I'm trying to build a solid presence for us is in Shenzhen. And the reason is last year in January, I sent a bunch of students along with Bunny Huang, who, if you don't know, he did Chumby, but he's the one that hacked the Xbox and turned this machine that Microsoft was selling at a loss in order to sell games into a Linux machine, and Microsoft didn't like that, and they sued, and MIT protected him, and so he's indebted to us. But no, but anyway, he knows, he learned Shenzhen when he was doing Chumby. So he took our students, and what happened was amazing, is they went there, and it turns out that all the factories that make Adidas and iPhones, they're all sort of aunts and uncles that are networked together that run these factories. And you can buy anything, and you could talk to anyone and get anything done. So that's. But what's amazing is that every single kid whose parents have enough money, like have a successful restaurant or something, the kid makes, not every, but most of, they make a cell phone, right? And the cell phone design. So if you go down to the stalls, there's just hundreds of cell phones designed like Hello Kitty, like cars, like, and so they make cell phones like kids in Palo Alto make websites, right? And what's also interesting is they don't sit there in a design room and design it. They sit there on the factory floor designing on the manufacturing equipment. So unless you have tooling grease under your nails, you're not a designer. And what happens is every week they come up with another model. They go downstairs, they sell it at the stalls, they compare with each other, they go back. And they don't call it this, but this is A/B testing, this is agile development, and they make hardware like we make software. And what's also fascinating about it is there's this $12 retail price Shenzhen phone with 5 megabytes of RAM, MP3 player, quad band GSM, OLED screen, Bluetooth, everything, right? And the only way you could make that, if you look at it, because there's no screws, it's just beautiful, but it's designed by somebody who stands in front of a manufacturing line all day long, thinking about how can I get this to do what I want. And one of the things I changed, when Nicholas Negroponte, who founded the lab, he famously said, rest of academia is publish or perish, we are demo or die. And he would say, your demo only has to work once. That was his famous saying. So I changed it recently to deploy or die. You have to actually take the stuff and send it out into the real world. So in the old days, because the cost of doing anything was so high, we would inspire these large companies to create Lego Mindstorms or Guitar Hero or the Kindle, but we wouldn't actually manufacture this stuff ourselves. Well, now, with Shenzhen, I realized that we don't have to sit there with a prototype that we can only make one of. We can make 100,000 of them and let people play with them and just go and do stuff. So it's already been true with websites. It's not true with hardware. And so I'm also trying to get some kids from Shenzhen to come to the lab to teach us as well, because I think there's also this interesting thing where I think Apple has gone, I think it's been primarily Apple, but has cracked down on a lot of the pirates. And a lot of these kids end up in jail because their side business is making fake iPhones, right? Or iPhones that when you swipe, it turns into an Android, and when you swipe again, it turns into an iPhone.
Yeah, that would be a favorite.
So they don't realize that they are actually extremely far ahead of the rest of the world in a particular kind of innovation. And so I want to sort of bring them in and get them working with us.
Yeah, some of the things, I mean, obviously there's a bunch of stuff from the hardware-software combination that the Valley's been looking at. It's been obviously wearables, which I think a lot, a bunch of touch points from the lab there. I actually think one of the other things that is you've only begun to see in the fringe of it is special purpose hardware design for different things. And like one of the things on the Bitcoin side, and this isn't public, so I can't say any more information about this, but I know a venture firm that's funded an ASIC developer for Bitcoin mining, right, as a kind of hardware specific in order to touch this. And I think that we're going to see a lot more of that in various ways. And it's one of the reasons why the principles of open source applied to software now also becomes applied to hardware. And how that innovation loop works. Because once you can begin doing A/B testing, once you can begin doing, okay, I launch it, I try it, and I can do it cheaply, and I can launch it and try it and do it again, then all of a sudden the rapidity of the innovation cycle goes way up and is almost categorically different. And I mean, I think that that's one of the things that, I think will get added into the Valley corpus. I'm not positive. We tend to be, it's very close to software. It tends to be where most of gravity is, but hardware and biology are beginning to touch that.
Yeah, but then you got the Tony Fadell's, and I think it's also a software view of the world. Taking on hardware is going to be ultimately successful.
Yeah, well, I think software is still key. I mean, that's part of how, when, for example, more or less the way that we look at this from Greylock is we say, well, we divide into practice of consumer and enterprise software, and we will do anything where software is the key part of it. Look, we will do hardware. We did Voodoo. David Z did his investment in Voodoo, and other Toy Talk, which is trying to make your toys talk to you through iPads and so forth. But as long as software is the kind of key element of it, because that's the Moore's law and the revolution cycle. And by the way, similar things in terms of biology. You touched on something that I think might be fun, since I think Silicon Valley folks have been thinking about Bitcoin for a while. So what is this MIT Bitcoin thing, and how have accountants become sexy?
So the MIT Bitcoin thing is actually a student. Some students made a thing called the MIT Bitcoin Club, and they went out and raised, I think last time I checked they had $500,000 from philanthropists and then they're going to give $100 to every student that's in the club, and to do whatever they want. And the idea, though, is so to me, Bitcoin is a hack on bookkeeping. Really, it's taking a ledger-based bookkeeping system and making it feasible for the first time in its current form because of encryption, and it's clever, but it's basically converting a bearer-based currency sort of cash into a ledger system. And the thing is that, the only reason I'm obsessed by this is, my friend Jay DeVetti, because it was one of the first people you met that was one of my friends, but he's an Indian genius. He was the CIO of Shinsei Bank, and he was able, Ripplewood, a foreign firm, bought the long-term credit bank of Japan when it was going bankrupt. He was able to cut the cost of the bank by 90% in 18 months by completely redoing all of the systems. The only reason he was able to do that is he's an accounting genius and a computer science genius. And the thing that's interesting was he told me his story, which was he was in school in India, and he was a whiz, and so he didn't study for his accounting class, and it was the first class where he failed or didn't do well. And then he realized you can't underestimate accounting. Everybody thinks it's boring, but it's actually really hard. And so he then just obsessed about accounting. And so he and I would sit around, he'd talk to me about bookkeeping and accounting and how, and the fact that no one else nerds out that much in that space as computer science people, it has kept the financial services business so behind. We have banks and stuff that are designed and no one hacks them, right? So to me, Bitcoin...
Well, no one hacks them that way. There's another kind of hacking. Yes.
Good hacking, right? But so to me, why Bitcoin's interesting for a lot of reasons, but from a MIT perspective, why Bitcoin's interesting is not in itself, but that it is now driving a lot of really smart people to start thinking about really basic bookkeeping problems, which I think is going to be the beginning of a fundamental change in the atomic units. Because everybody is kind of like, let's assume standard accounting systems. What can we hack? So option pricing. And so all the rocket scientists went into hacking a system on top of something that was actually pretty old. It's kind of like when you look at the computer chip companies, let's assume a silicon crystalline wafer. Most of the computer chip guys don't even know the physics and the phenomenon behind the memories that they work on anymore. And very few companies can actually go in and open the black box. I mean, some of them do, but they're very few. So accounting and bookkeeping is kind of like the material science of money that a lot of smart people hadn't been focused on, but I think that now that they are, I think there's going to be a huge wave. And to me, having a lot of random MIT undergrads messing around is going to generate, because the problem is if you come from the old financial world, it's really hard to think about a world built up of, bits instead of atoms.
Would this be an alternative way of stating what you just said, or would you mod this, which is essentially what Bitcoin has done is it's reinvented the platform as ledger, and that ledger now can be innovated on in various ways, extended, apps can be built on it, et cetera. And that accessibility then allows essentially geeks, designers, engineers to begin hacking on, and that's what opens up innovation. Is that what you, or is it something else?
Well, so there's a couple different layers, right? So there's Bitcoin itself possibly evolving into something that could be a platform. Internet did it in its own sort of way. But it's also just kind of focusing a lot of smart, it's like the brain. So the brain, when we were growing up, no one studied the brain. The brain was one of the most underfunded things ever. I mean, considering how important it was.
To say, I think there was.
Yeah, no, but considering how important it is for us, no one really spent money on funding it. But now it's the thing. Obama's talking about it. But it's when you get a lot of smart people geeking out on something, it creates a sort of critical mass, and because also smart people want to hang out with smart people, and you know, and I see Accenture here and stuff like that. Nothing against accountants, but the image of an accounting firm is not the image where you're like the physics, math, quant person is going to want to go. I mean, at MIT there are the people who do like quantum accounting. I mean, there are the fringe people who are really into advanced accounting, but the general undergraduate student.
I'm not even sure I know what quantum accounting is, but okay.
But the general undergraduate
Stop there until
student,
you measure it. I mean, anyway, sorry.
Well,
Schrodinger's books.
Yeah, no, it is actually related to that. But I guess the thing is just having a volume of people, because also this a lot of innovation comes out of trying a lot of things, right? And so to me that Bitcoin is bringing attention to an area that sorely needed a lot of brain power attention, because I think a lot of the stuff that's screwed up, whether you're talking about network security or the fragility of the systems. I'm on the audit committee at the New York Times, which is giving me a view into how unviewable our financial system is. And so a lot of these things, I think, when people start figuring, well, why don't we just do this? Why don't we just do that?
So I agree with everything you said, by the way, in terms of the Bitcoin stuff. I would add one thing that I think is important to add to that view, which is part of the notion of if you can create an effectively network distributed integral trust system where the trust resides in the network and all the network, and not just one node of authority, that allows all kinds of new innovation to be created on top of it. Now, Ledger is absolutely one of the important ones.
Right.
But there's various things, like Bitcoin has been making me think about how DNS should work, for the internet, and these sorts of, there's a bunch of potential unlockings by having the network be the authority.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And I think a lot of us have thought about, like I was on the ICANN board, and we thought a lot about DNS and trust and security DNS, but it definitely lights a fire under it when it's suddenly more money involved, right?
Yes.
So I think Bitcoin is fanning a lot of really important flames that need to be fanned. So
let's shift to in a few minutes, by the way, I'll be asking questions in the audience as well, and the questions can come to either of us about anything that the whole group would be interested in. Let's talk a little bit about the future of university, right? And one of the things that, the memes that go around Silicon Valley frequently are we disrupt industries. We think about how disruption, one of the best definitions of disruption I tend to work with is you take $10 of what is revenue or GDP and now replace $1, and that $1 then becomes a platform enabling other things. That's part of the reason why the disruptive cycle is, the Schumpeter creative destruction, and it's important. And obviously people have been kicking around a lot of stuff. You've got Coursera here, you've got Udacity, you've got media. MIT did its own
MITx,
MITx. And so there's been a lot of thinking about what the future of the university is going to be. What are your, at least partial perspectives on that from a Media Lab and other?
Yeah. So there's a future of education, which is a broader thing in which the future of university is part of, and I think, and it ties to your book as well. I don't think that we're preparing people to be fully functional. Because and I think you can blame it all the way, you can go to Carnegie, but you can also blame it on the companies who are hiring people because they have degrees or they have grades, because that drives a testing culture to make sure that people meet the requirements for the degree. And the tests are usually about you as an individual, so it's not that much about collaboration. It's literally tests of skills and knowledge, which is great for, if you're in a factory, or if you're stuck on top of a mountain with a number 2 pencil and no mobile phone. But in most cases, you're going to have a mobile phone, you're going to have Wikipedia, and your value to society is going to be how can you pull the people and the knowledge that you need when you need it, and then turn it into something valuable. And it's this ability to produce, the ability to think, the ability to ask questions, and those are not easy to assess. But I'm even in the Media Lab where it's almost the opposite of that. When I do a tenure case, or when I'm hiring a faculty member, but this paper has multiple authors. How do we know that it was this person's contribution? Is there a single paper that this person is heavily cited? And what did this person do by themselves? And it's always by themselves. And so it's not about networking. And obviously being cited and stuff like that is sort of networky, but it's networking in kind of a one-dimensional way. And so to me, preparing people for assuming that they're networked and assuming that skills and knowledge are less important than ability to gain those skills and the knowledge when you need them, rather than having to, because to me university feels like, okay, you have to memorize the encyclopedia before you're allowed to go out and do anything, is the opposite, because you have the encyclopedia in your pocket now. So that shift away from packing knowledge in your brain into being creative, and I think it makes sense, because in a society where machines and computers are not yet strong enough to do the repetitive tasks humans needed to do in the Industrial Revolution, you wanted reliable, similar, standardized human beings as units of work. But today, when robots and computers are doing everything that is repeatable, or that they can do, you don't want computers that act like robots and human beings, which is sort of, or robots and computers, which is sort of what a lot of universities try to create, right? So I think that that's the big problem, and then kind of there's a whole bunch of stuff on how you would do it.
Do you have any suggestions on what the mods are? Right, because most of the dialogue that I see happen within the university system is kind of like, are MOOCs sufficient, would be the way of putting the question. And to some degree, that's a trivial answer. Of course they're not sufficient. But of course, they're one innovation along a path to how do we change the outcomes, both in cost and results.
Right. So I think MOOCs are a better knowledge and skill delivery system. But knowledge and skill delivery is the one thing that I think we need to not do as much of. But they will argue that if you make that part more efficient, you have more time for the other stuff. So the word that is often used is called the flipped classroom. Instead of sitting with butts in your seat listening to a lecture, you watch the lecture at home and you come and you interact when you're at the university. So that sort of makes sense. Although I would kind of argue that, having said that, well, you're putting all your money and all of your energy in building the knowledge delivery system, but we really don't sit around talking about, well, now that we have the time in the class, what do we do? And how do we make that more effective? We are doing more peer learning online. So we did this thing called learning creative learning, where we said, okay, well, we're not going to teach you anything. You're going to teach yourselves. We'll have a guided conversation. We'll set up communities, and I think 25,000 people showed up, 10,000 stayed in. But we didn't give any degrees. We didn't give any points. And halfway through, the community started making their own software. And to me, that's much more interesting also, which is when you look at open source software, it's peer learning. Like Mozilla, we're both involved in Mozilla. I mean, people teach each other, and you learn, everybody knows you learn more when you're teaching, right? And so the idea of like this master journeyman apprentice model of a networked system, and so I think 7 billion teachers is a much more interesting goal than one person teaching 7 billion people, which is kind of the MOOC model. I think there's a role for them, but I think that the social also behavior of learning and teaching is also really important, because I still think that, especially in the developing world, everybody wants that degree to get that job. And it all goes back to jobs. And you will spend a lot of money to get a degree. But the problem also when you're degree driven, you're spending all your time focused on getting out of school, right? That's the whole point, is to get out of here, get my degree and get out of here. But well, what about, so for my first year PhD students, which are the ones that we get for 4 years, I say, always imagine that I may just take your degree away when you're leaving and say, psych. And then I want you to be able to look back and say, it was still worth it. And to think about the degree as a scaffolding for you having an amazing time and learning a lot of stuff. Otherwise, I don't want you here. I want people here who don't want to leave, you know.
Yep. So I think we'll shift to questions now. I still have a stack, and I think all I'm supposed to do is say next question, and then the folks here will tell me who so you're selecting, or am I selecting? Okay, great. Yep. Great.
So, Reid, just thank you for that slide presentation on the startup of you. I had the pleasure of sitting with my niece, who's in 10th grade, and telling her all about it and how she should figure her life out with those slides. We got up to slide number 100 and something, and then she started getting bored, but it was really worth it. So thank you. And you know, the question I have is, we talk about Bitcoin, and we talk about trust, and we talk about all these issues that are, you know, almost transnational at this point, right? And as we've seen with Google as well, the regulatory environment in EU is kind of came out of left field. We have no idea. How is an entrepreneur, how are a community of entrepreneurs going to confront some of these fairly complex transnational issues where nation states do have a real cause for concern? I mean, they do have a real cause. So any thoughts on the Bitcoin angle, and from both of you, actually,
Yep,
that'd be great.
yep, happy to. One of the things that's wondrous and complicating and hopefully not terrible about being more and more in the networked age, which is part of how I refer to what we are, is the network essentially gets an inertia and a life to its own, such that innovations and changes and things can happen in ways that aren't under a classic nation-state control. And you know, Bitcoin is precisely one of those things, because if you actually look at the vast majority of, like, one of the ways that countries, you know, have historically worked is the banking system is very tightly regulated by the country, and then there is specific cross-border regulatory infrastructure that causes it very difficult to drive innovations across it. And that actually goes all the way back to the PayPal and how do you launch Japan and how Joey and I met. So, and you know, part of the question will then be is, like, for example, I think that, you know, it's going to be very difficult for government folks to figure out how should modern treaties be expressed. Should they be expressed in code, right? What are the kinds of principles in that? This is one of the reasons why Joey and I both, Joey's on the foundation board, I'm on the corporation board of Mozilla. And so in terms of guidance for entrepreneurs, it's a question of to say, well, understand that that part of his technology is changing the world, that there will be friction points with regulation, there'll be friction points with government, and you have to have that as part of your thinking about what your startup plan is going to be, what you're going to be doing. And so what I do personally there is I look at whether it's Bitcoin in financial services or Airbnb and kind of zoning regulation, as I go, okay, what should the mature design of the ecosystem be? Why is that better for all the individuals? Why is that also better for society? And then how do you step in the way to doing that and recognize that there will be a number of places where you'll be reconciling, helping the system change as that happens. And so, for example, in the case of Airbnb, it's like, well, it's better for a bunch of the individuals because people can then you know, kind of sublet rooms or apartments in ways that offer unique experiences, create income for themselves. That kind of, you know, that kind of income creation is valuable for a region, for service, for individuals, and then also for travelers, they get a unique kind of experience. So it's valuable for both in terms of how it plays, and that's the kind of thing. And by the way, you know, there's regulatory issues for Airbnb in the cities, but there's also in other countries. So the transnational. This could be a subject of an entire hour's talk itself, so I'm going to stop there and then
and I guess the only thing I would say is I'm a little disappointed by the lack of creativity in institution hacking by people who should be more innovative. And I think partially it's because Silicon Valley exists in a slight bubble, and it exists because they were able to ignore a lot of institutions by being out here. On the East Coast, one of the things that you do see is you see a lot of interesting hackers who've hacked their way into a funny situation in government, in the military, in large institutions. And also you see a lot of nonprofits, some of them out here, who are very creative at figuring out whether it's the overthrow of governments to figuring out how to do something creative. You see Google hiring the exact same lobbyists that AT&T hires, doing the same old-fashioned lobbying. And you know, I realize they don't have time to be innovative in that space, but I wish that there was a little bit more energy. But I think partially, this is, you don't make money being a regulatory hacker, but you make a lot of money hacking companies, right? So I think one of those things that maybe this is a regional collaboration that we do, but a lot of kids at the Media Lab, for instance, our Center for Civic Media, they spend their whole life trying to figure out disruptive ways to do regulatory changes and things like that, and maybe that's something. I mean, well, Google does talk to us about that stuff, but I think that's, we could do more of that.
Next question.
Hi, good evening, Reid and Joy. Wonderful conversations. Really enjoyed it. I was very, I guess, excited by the conversation about the University of Future and how you need to bring the element of social element of cooperation into that. And it reminded me of this conversation I had with one of the professors at Stanford in the Department of Education, that we were talking, what is really needed is teach people how to connect the dots and how to synthesize tons of information coming at them and picking up the right thing and connect the dots. And one thing that was very interesting was, I remembered the leadership class I took 30 years ago at HP. They gave us different information to 5 of us without us knowing it, and said to come up with an answer, and we were fighting with each other till one of us finally said, let me see your information that you have, and they were trying to teach us to communicate. My question, I guess, on this is, how do we test that ability of people who can communicate, connect the dots, and get that? Because I've been, since my conversation about 6 months ago on this with this university professor, I've really been struggling on, okay, how do we define? We say, forget about the way of testing in the past, that you memorize something, as you say, you sit on top of a mountain with a pencil and try to answer it. How do we do these tests? My proposal was allow people to bring their laptops, bring their friends. If they can con somebody, 5 of their friends to come and sit there, it says they have leadership ability and makes sense, but I don't know whether that's realistic or not. Do you guys have any comments on that?
Well, actually, that's a great question, actually. I'm working on an essay on network literacy in terms of how to think about, like, for example, as you go through different phases of the information age, different kinds of literacy are important, not just the literacy of reading and writing language, but search literacy. And I actually think network literacy is one of the points of literacy that's becoming, and it's everything from a literacy of how do you search networks to also how do you network within people. But a test for that, I'm not sure I have a good answer. Do you have a good answer off the top of your head?
I mean, LinkedIn sort of is a version of this, which is you know, your references are kind of a test. I mean, if it depends where you are in your career. I mean, you're not going to do this with a 10-year-old, but if you're an adult, the network that you've created shows both your taste and your aptitude, right? I think that there was an interesting article, I think, from February in the New York Times by a great newspaper, by the way.
One that you happen to be on the board of.
But it was a Google HR person saying that grade point average seems to have no statistically relevant.
Laszlo Bock.
Laszlo Bock was saying that it has no statistically is not statistically relevant in how well the person does, and that now some teams in Google have up to 14% college dropouts, which is a departure from their GPA, Stanford degree-driven hiring. But I don't think they've figured out how to change it. But they have data that shows that just focusing on GPA isn't Right. And I think everyone's struggling a little bit with the assessment. It was funny, there was a company that does do assessments, and the head of assessments in HR was at the Media Lab. And we gave her a demo, and she talked, and she came back, she says, I already found 8 people that I want to hire. And I said, how did you decide you wanted to hire them? And I said, did you give them a test? And he said, no, but I talked to them, and I knew right away that they would fit in perfectly. And I said, ha! And she goes, you know, and so you know, because her whole job was trying to quantify the assessment system. I think the hardest part is really going to be how do you scale it, right? So how do you, so like if you come to the Media Lab, we have gone through, you know, hundreds of applicants to narrow them down to a couple dozen, and then we work on them so that your return is pretty high on your investment of talking to kids. But if you're getting 1 million applications, how do you sort for the first bunch? Because I do think, and I think there was an IBM study, at least I heard this in IBM Japan, this is now foggy memory, so don't quote me on this, but there was a study on who did the interviews, and then how well the person did later. And the more senior and sort of so-called wise, but probably looking at different things, the more senior the interviewer, the more likely the person being hired had that aptitude. And people tended not to want to hire people who were more senior than themselves and things like that. So the interview process, I think, has a lot of human nature built in that figures a lot of this stuff out. But I think the harder part is how do you do that? Because I think Google has actually, in that article, it talks about, you know, we ask these kinds of questions, and it's a very tricky way of trying to figure out whether somebody's a thinker. But they still have to filter the inbound.
Next question.
Hey, Reid. Hey, Joey. I guess in the world where there's so many more things than there are people now, and our identity is becoming sort of a function of LinkedIn and a variety of other things, how do you think, you know, do you think we're going to have our own personal network that we take with us to somebody else's house or to work or to a hotel, or, you know, what do you think of this whole concept of taking your network with you and having some kind of security and privacy and identity around that?
Just a refinement. Do you mean network as in people, or do you mean network as in like will be wearables and cybernetics, or both?
More your identity. So, you know, if, for example, in our house, we only have one SSID, which most people have. But I think we're going to have more than that, because we're going to have guests, and we're going to have our finances, our health, and all that. And then as we move around, you know, we become a function of this sort of network identity, and or the vice versa, our network identity becomes a function of the things that we have. I mean, there must be some thought around IoT and identity going on, right?
Do you want to start, and then I'll add in?
Yeah, sure. So I think this is the problem, right? And I think talking about trust networks, identity within trust networks, what sorts of identities and identifiers are necessarily to complete the right transactions. But I think in the world of big data, and now with NSA and everything, the idea of, like for instance, you know, if I'm going to a library, there's no reason the guard at the library has to know my name and where I live. They just need to know that this person's face links with a membership to the library and should be allowed access. And so there's a sort of fundamental thing, which is, I think there should be a minimum amount of identity necessary to complete any particular transaction is what you should be forced to reveal. And I think that the architecture of identity is going to have to change to be focused more on what is necessary to complete this loop of trust in order for something to happen. And that's going to change eventually, because I think the market's going to demand it. But just like spam and just like security and everything else, it will only change, because we all know private enhancement technology is something I've been working on since the internet started. And nobody will buy it because nobody wants it. And I think it's like spam. It has to get really painful before people are willing to say, I'm not going to use this anymore. Because remember the time when everyone said, oh, the internet's broken, we can't use it anymore. Spam has destroyed it. And then finally the company said, okay, we'll fix it. And they fixed it. And I think with a lot of the identity stuff, what's going to happen is people are going to start getting hurt. They're going to get identity with that. It's going to get worse before it gets better. But when once it gets better version, I think is going to have a lot more personalized identity with a lot more control and transparent. And I think the other important thing is transparency of those who use your information, because you're going to get it collected anyway. But to me, the worst thing in the world that stresses me out is what is the model that they have about me. Like right now, I can't get TSA pre. And so I went through every single network I could possibly find until I finally found somebody important enough to be able to tell me that, oh, well, it turns out the lawful permanent resident database, there's a glitch in the connection with the TSA pre-database, and so that's why you're not getting it. And so stop trying to fix it. But then my wife got it this morning, so go figure. But what to me is I don't want to end up on a no-fly list where they may have information that's wrong about me, and I think the ability to go in and change that I think is going to be key.
I think I agree with a lot of those principles. I mean, the other two things to add is obviously the bar is moving relative to what's the amount of publicity about my identity that provides valuable services to me, right? And
what do you think about the Google ruling?
Which one?
So the one in Europe that made it that's saying that Google can't
forget ruling. I think generally speaking, I think that's a good thing, especially as it applies to companies. I do think that one of the kind of the nuances is so, for example, you always have to look at in ecosystem design unintended consequences. So, for example, people trying to hack financial systems and fraudsters, actually one of the things, the whole thing is you actually want to remember information in order to have a robust. So you have to have some kind of, there's always a kind of principles of balance in terms of how do you construct it. And I also think that one of the things that what happens is frequently when you frame privacy things and you say, well, we're just going to take this data and do something you don't know about it. You're like, oh, that sounds terrible. It's like, oh, but we're going to provide this service that you really like. I mean, this is a little bit of like the kind of the Facebook thing. It's like, okay, your friends are going to upload pictures, other friends are going to tag them, and then it's going to be shown to all your friends before you get a chance to see them. You can kind of redact it. What do you think about that? And you say, well, that sounds a little scary to me. And then everyone uses Facebook because like, oh, actually, in fact, this constructs a live stream of actually moments that mattered to me in terms of, and then the system self-regulates. So I think the bar shifts, I think, is one thing on that. And then the other thing is it gets a lot more, the other issue on identity that's going to be solved is that there's a lot of things where group patterns and identity will actually seriously help the overall efficiency of society, anything from medicine, right, kind of genetic coding and these sorts of things to traffic patterns, and how do we sort out individual rights versus collective rights there is kind of seriously interesting. To give you an example, one of the things, and this is not quite the identity question, but when Joey and I were driving here down 101, we were talking about how self-driving cars will change all kinds of things, and one of the questions that Joey put to me, which I hadn't thought about before, which I'm now thinking about, is if your car knew that by doing this and driving this way would kill you but would save 2 other lives, what should the car do?
Yeah, right, exactly.
Right? And I was like, oh, complicated question. But those are the kinds of questions we're going to get into.
Yeah.
So.
And I think the bioengineering is actually going to, so one pro tip, according to George Church, bioengineering is dropping in price at 6 times Moore's law in many of the areas. So, personal gene sequencing will be like probably within a couple of years, you'll all probably want to do it. And then CRISP is this new protein technology that goes in that you can go and edit very cheaply your genes. And so we will probably in our lifetime be modifying genes of our children and ourselves to start to eliminate certain things. The bioethical
quite scary in all kinds of
conversation
ways.
around that. And he's also starting to research personal biospheres because he feels that extinction event by an accidental teenager is a real risk now.
Because of being able to hack biology. Yeah. With that, next question.
Okay. I come from the world of digital fabrication and advanced manufacturing, and I'm kind of curious as to y'all's advice for those that are bringing innovation into industries where you're going to have a serious restructure of skill sets for people who are normally very hesitant toward change.
So I think there's a pair of MIT professors, Eric Brynjolfsson and Andy McAfee, who also worry about this topic. And their general worry is with the changing disruption, how do you have the right kind of ability for labor force to retool in order to stay employed? And I think the broad level answer to this is taking the same kind of techniques for transforming how ongoing education goes, how an ability to kind of do continuous learning throughout your career, not to have this old industrial model, because where it's like, well, I had the time where I'm a student and now I'm in the factory or I'm now in the field. Like, it's like, no, you have to be learning every year, and that has to be an ongoing pattern, is part of how we're all kind of, I think all modern careers, especially professional careers, are trending to, and that's one of the reasons why the notion of ongoing education and constant retooling is important. And so I think you have to then figure out how we deploy these technologies in order to help with that as the outcome for people who are in the workforce. I don't know if there's anything you'd add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is going to be harder for the more senior and half-retired people who don't want to or don't have the incentive to put the investment into trying to retool. But for the young kids, I know like Van Jones and others are doing the Yes We Code. I mean, for a lot of the, the less advantaged neighborhoods, learning to code provides a tremendous opportunity, and that's a market failure where we just don't have enough coders. And learning to code is actually possible. I mean, it turns out it's not that hard, and you can also, again with the peer learning, there is a cellular division model. So if you teach people how to do pair programming, you can start involving people who are less experienced, and it sort of scales. You don't need tons and tons of infrastructure to do that. So I think teaching kids to code, and it's interesting because I think that the workshops that they've started to do have been extremely successful. It's not like the intuitive thing to do, but it's the obvious thing when you look at the numbers. And so I think that's going to be a pretty successful initiative.
Next question.
Hey, gentlemen. So in the last century, a fellow named Karl Marx suggested that there'd be the withering away of the nation state, which didn't happen in the way that he suggested. However, what you're talking about with networks and what George is doing with biology tends to think that institutions aren't going to keep up, and we've talked a little bit about that with universities and so forth. What do you think can happen to enable them to keep up, or what will enable us when we have today, the government trying to take on the Chinese, and maybe there might be a little bit of back and forth on that. What do you think will get us beyond or transcend some of those issues that can help the institutions keep up with what we're doing?
Why don't you start?
Well, so Joshua Ramo, who's the managing director of Kissinger Associates, has a book called Age of the Unthinkable.
Awesome book.
It's a good book.
Well worth reading.
Yeah. His background is in physics, Santa Fe Institute, complexity, but he's now kind of at the helm of really thinking about international relations. He's one of the key experts on China. But he's doing like ultimatum theory, game theory analysis. I mean, the problem is international relations and statesmanship is still in the dark ages. Yeah. And what it is now, it's happening in a world of extreme complexity. I spend a lot of time in the Middle East, and it's as complex. It's so complex that you can't really parse it in any. It doesn't solve. It's like in hyperspace. It's not in Euclidean space. And so I think what needs to happen is just like every other industry that had physicists and people who understand math jump in and try to model things in a different way. I think the military and international relations needs that. The problem is that there isn't a strong flow of people into those into that sector because of the way that institutions are set up. And so, to your point, when I think about the institutions, I think about programs like Code for America and others. At the municipal level, you can see some trickling in, but it's how do you do impact? I think nonprofits and NGOs can help. But I do think that, so at the Media Lab, I do see a lot of physics nerds getting interested in things like international relations, getting interested in trying to solve Syria, and modeling those as physics problems and network problems rather than text. So I think it'll take a while, but I think part of it will be coming up with the right models and then having enough senior administration that can parse it. And I think right now. And we see this failure already starkly in cybersecurity, where the senior people just don't use computers, so they don't understand kind of emotionally or viscerally what's going on, and the fact that a bunch of teenagers could actually cause a lot of havoc and don't, because they don't want to kill their host. That's the power dynamic, and get used to it. You don't have control.
So two things to add into that. One is Mark Pincus has generated an idea that I think is very interesting, which is create a digital West Point, because you essentially need to have, and this relates to the second idea, is you need to have more engineers or hackers or geeks, nerds, as actors within these institutions. And so typically one of the problems is the way that a programmer is thought of in very old school institutions, which includes governments, is like, well, I will write out exactly what you do and then you go do it. Right? And it's like, no, actually you have to figure out how to treat these things as more organic systems. You have to figure out how to hack them. You have to figure out how to possibly create new things in them. And that was part of like the throwaway comment I made earlier about, well, what happens if you can write treaties in code, or should treaties be in code? And for example, if people want something to kind of funnily think about, when Bitcoin is an international network distributed ledger, one of the things you could do in a cyber treaty is you could actually articulate financial penalties in Bitcoin that would automatically be triggered. So if I did something, the Bitcoin would essentially, as a country, the Bitcoin essentially would be transferred, as opposed to the way the system works today, which is, no, I'm not going to pay it, or that kind of thing. There's all kinds of interesting things about hacking it. The second thing is that it's, I think, extremely important. This is one of the reasons why love organizations like the Churchill Club and so forth, to actually have the dialogue about this, to understand where the future is going. And part of one of the things I've told a number of U.S. politicians is, it's stunning to me how many the ratio of foreign politicians I host here in Silicon Valley relative to domestic ones, right? Like, it's like, guys, come out and talk. It really matters. Let me put it this way: like the shadow chancellor of the chancellor of the Exchequer of the UK was the shadow chancellor at the time. George Osborne spent a week out here trying to figure out what was going on, so he knew how to help the UK. It was like, that's a really great thing. And so that sort of thing, I think, would be another partial answer. Next question.
How you guys doing? I think you guys are both great. I have a comment for Mr. Ito regarding the Silicon Valley model of putting something up and then backing it in, trying to find a business model for that. Richard Branson just wrote an article on LinkedIn. It was innovating the model. Does anybody talk about hacking the business model at the Media Lab, and are you concerned about that going forward in terms of the money we spend in terms of innovating without real business models going forward?
Well, I think Reid may be able to even answer better than me. I mean, I don't think that not focusing on revenue is not having a business model. I think the idea that distribution and scale have tremendous business value and are the harder part of the problem, and that once you have distribution and scale, it's easy to get meetings, it's easy to generate cash, and that the traditional obsession on the so-called business model, which is actually roughly translated by some people into the wrong thing, which is cash flow. It's a short-sighted focus, And so to me, I don't think it's that these companies like Twitter and others aren't focusing on a business model. It is a business model to focus on things like scale. I think at the Media Lab, we tend not to focus on. We focus on impact. We want to hit the real world, but a lot of our stuff intentionally is answers looking for questions, because sometimes you'll discover stuff that wouldn't normally be allowed to be searched for if your focus was on something with utility from the beginning. And so we're even, I think at the Media Lab, we're even more sort of discovery and search oriented than in Silicon Valley. But do you want to talk a little bit about business models?
Well, I think the high line is actually, in fact, business model hacking is one of the things that's better done on the startup and venture side than it is on the university side, because we have much better understanding about how these ecosystems potentially come together than almost anyone, even in really advanced places or unique places in the academy like the Media Lab. We have a much better sense of that. Now, I do think that everything you said is right, which is frequently one of the things that happens in consumer internet is actually get to scale first matters. Sometimes different in other areas, but in consumer, and because that's a harder problem than the business model problem. Now, that being said, I think that one of the things that's interesting is frequently what happens is people get to scale for consumer internet, and then they forget that there's additional business model innovation that you can do. I mean, that's the thing that made Google its powerhouse, was AdWords, right? It was like, it wasn't just, oh, we have X page views, we actually have a business model that goes with it. You're seeing similar things happening now with, the kind of the news feed, sponsored update innovations, which are creating interesting ad models, which, are kind of new iterations in the product. I think what Google is doing at the YouTube with TrueView is actually an interesting, is to think about business model innovations and hacking is actually an important part of the entrepreneurial process. Now, for consumer internet investments, frequently it's irrelevant unless you get to millions, hundreds of millions of people. So if you haven't figured out your distribution, like when an entrepreneur comes to me for the consumer internet and says, what should I focus on first? Like, focus on distribution. Like, do think about hacking the business model later and have some thought to it, but get to that after you've solved the distribution problem.
But I do think, though, the place where we do get to hack a little bit is there's a certain kind of scale that you need to be at before you can hack a business model in a certain way.
Yes, true.
Right? You have to have at least one user.
Yes.
So
usually more than one.
Yeah. But the thing that we get is we get 80 companies telling us their deepest, darkest secrets about where they think they're going to die. And then we get to sort of say, well, what about this? What about that? And and they'll test it. And and even at the New York Times, we'll test things like the paywall and stuff like that. And so there's a certain kind of business model hacking that you do once you've got a platform or a brand that you can't do if you're just a startup with, just in the early phase. Right?
Yes, although that's a long conversation. I think this is the last question.
Okay, we have one here.
Okay.
So we heard a moment ago that you can't make money from hacking regulations. And I know that's not true because I've done it. There's been a Cambrian explosion of law-related startups that are trying to hack at regulatory anomalies, friction, that kind of thing. What I've really noticed, coming from east to west, is that people don't care. They don't care about things that are outside their bubble. They don't care about hunger, human rights. And that's not as true in the East. You guys are uniquely positioned to talk about social innovation in the Bay Area and how to do that. So how do you burst the bubble and get people in the Bay hacking sort of big social problems that are global in nature?
Let me shift your question slightly, although I will answer the full thing. So, because I serve on a board a bunch of nonprofits. I've actually had Paul Farmer, who's Partners in Health, come out here several times to connect with the Valley. What I've realized in terms of the Valley's focus, the Valley is very much kind of otaku about technology and entrepreneurship. And that's a Japanese word for kind of like obsessive geek. And so what I have found, the way to get resonance on whether it's hunger or education, there's some interest in because of talent and all the rest, international relations, is to make it somewhat navigable by that skill set. Like, how does that skill set, or how do those things, entrepreneurship and technology, apply to this? And then they start getting very interested, because it's kind of a strong interest on these two things. They don't kind of go, oh, I'm just trying to solve world hunger. They go, I've got these tools that are really interesting, and you can create this massive disruptive breakout thing. They say, oh, and here's how you apply them to this. And so, for example, if you would go to people and say, well, microfinance, it's like, okay, that's kind of interesting. Kiva, oh, that's really interesting. Right? That's the kind of pattern that frequently happens, and that would be one part that I would answer in that. But
no, I think that's right. I think that maybe there's some East Coast, West Coast bridging that could be useful, because I think a lot of the, like Knight Foundation, MacArthur Foundation, we fund a lot of startups that have a really interesting social mission, but don't have a lot of nerd firepower. And I think the success of things like Code for America, where you go out and suddenly you realize that you walk into an environment where your skills are able to completely change a city, or to completely change a whole bunch of people, and then you get addicted to it. It's kind of like the modern version of the Peace Corps. I think if we would just send some of these geeks out for just a year, take a break, go off and do something interesting, go to Africa, and come back, they may get the bug. And I think that a lot of it has to do with being in an environment where you're pretty safe, where you don't have to focus on the world news. I think it's a little bit about getting out more.
Oh, yeah, geeks get out more. That could be a tagline. I think that's it.
Reid and Joey, want to thank you so much. You have been so generous with your time and with your thoughts, and we really appreciate it, right?